The 2 worst years of my life gave me something that the best years never could. I failed completely, not once, twice. And I want to tell you precisely what I learned from those failures that I could not have learned any other way, and exactly what you can do starting today with whatever failure is sitting in your life right now. Because if you are carrying a failure right now, you are carrying the most valuable education available to a builder. The question is whether you know how to read it. Stay with me. Because by the end of this, you will. I am Henry Ford. Before the Ford Motor Company, before the assembly line, before the Model T changed how the world moved, I failed at 2 automobile companies. The first one fell apart and took my investors' money with it. The second one collapsed too, and that one I built with my own hands for years before it was gone. I was not young and careless when these happened. I was a grown man with a family and a clear direction, and I still failed, publicly, completely, in ways that left nothing standing. And I am grateful for both of them, not in the weak way people say that when they want to seem wise. I am grateful in the specific way a man is grateful for the tool that built everything he has, because that is exactly what the failures were. This message is about that tool and how to use it. Listen to this every day. What I am about to describe takes more than one hearing to become something you can actually act on. Most people read failure the wrong way. They read it as a verdict. A verdict means the case is closed, the judgment is in, and you have been found lacking. A verdict does not invite further investigation. It ends the investigation, and when a person reads their failure as a verdict on themselves, they take the most specific and valuable information available to them about what went wrong and seal it away behind a judgment that makes the information inaccessible. The right reading is a report. A report means something happened. Here is exactly what happened. Here is where it broke. Here is what was weak. Here is what would have needed to be different. A report invites further investigation. A report is full of specific, actionable information. And the failure, read correctly as a report, tells you things about your operation that no amount of advanced thinking could have told you, because advanced thinking is only as good as the beliefs you are thinking inside of, and the failure shows you precisely where your beliefs were wrong. This is the first thing I want you to understand deeply before we go further. Failure is the highest resolution information available to a builder. Success in ordinary conditions tells you that things are working, but it does not tell you which specific elements are strong and which elements are working only because the conditions have not yet stressed them. Failure stresses everything, and whatever breaks under that stress is the exact thing you needed to know about. My first company broke in a specific place. The relationship between the quality of what I was producing and the cost of producing it at that quality was off, and I had believed it was right. The belief felt solid because I had built it from real thinking and real observation, but the thinking and the observation had not been tested against the scale of a real operation under real conditions. When the real operation ran under real conditions, the relationship between quality and cost was revealed to be different from what I had believed, not approximately different. Specifically different, in ways I could measure after the fact. That measurement was worth more than anything I had invested in the company. Not because it was pleasant. It was not pleasant at all. But because it was specific calibration data about the exact mismatch that had caused the collapse, which meant I knew precisely what to redesign in the next attempt. Here is something important about how I held that data during the period right after the failure, when the temptation to read the whole thing as a verdict on me was strongest. I want to be honest about this because pretending the temptation was not there would be dishonest and would make this message less useful than it should be. The verdict temptation was real. I had worked hard. I had believed the direction was right. I had involved people who trusted me, and their trust had been rewarded with loss. The story I could have told myself was, I am not the kind of man who can build this. I was wrong about my ability. I should go back to wage work and stay there. That story was available. It fit the visible facts, and it was completely wrong. The story that fit the actual facts was different. A specific element of the operation was miscalibrated. The miscalibration was now clearly visible, and the next attempt with that specific element redesigned would not fail in the same place. This story was harder to hold during the emotional aftermath of the failure, because the emotional aftermath was heavy and the verdict story offered the relief of a closed case. But the report story was the true one, and holding the report story through the emotional aftermath was the most important decision I made in that period. Hold the report story. When a failure is fresh and the emotional weight of it is real, the verdict story feels more honest because it matches the size of the pain. But the pain is not information about your capability. The pain is just the size of the thing you tried. A man who never tried anything significant never has significant pain from failure. The size of your pain after a failure is actually a rough measure of the size of what you were building toward. Do not read it as a verdict. Read it as evidence that you were attempting something worth attempting. There was a man I knew in those years named Clarence who worked in a machine shop near the early facility where I was developing the engine. Clarence was technically skilled in a way that was obvious to anyone who watched him work. His hands understood machinery the way some men understand language. He had started a small manufacturing operation 3 years before I knew him, put real savings into it, brought in a partner, and lost everything when the operation failed in its second year. By the time I knew Clarence, he had been back at wage work for over a year, and he described the failure, when it came up, in terms that revealed clearly how he had read it. He said the failure had shown him that he was not the type of man suited for running his own operation. He had good hands, but not the right judgment for the decisions that running an operation required. This was his verdict on himself, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who has closed the case. One afternoon I asked him to describe specifically what had gone wrong. Not the general story of why he thought he had failed, the specific story of what had actually happened, what specific thing had stopped functioning, and when, and why. He described it, and what he described was not a failure of judgment in the general sense. What he described was a single specific decision about the timing of a purchase of raw materials that had been made without accurate information about the supplier's reliability, combined with a cash position that could not absorb the delay when the supplier failed to deliver. One specific decision, made with incomplete information, in a cash position that had no buffer for the consequence of getting that decision wrong. That was not a verdict on Clarence. That was a report on two very specific and very fixable problems: incomplete information about a supplier and a cash position with no buffer. Both of those problems are solvable. Neither of them is about whether Clarence was the kind of man suited for running an operation, but Clarence had read the failure as a verdict and sealed away the report. The specific and actionable information inside the failure was inaccessible to him because the verdict interpretation had closed the door. Clarence never went back to building his own operation, not because he lacked the capability, but because the verdict he had read from the failure told him he did. That verdict was wrong. The capability was there. The report had shown him exactly what needed to be different, but the report was never read, and so it could never be applied. This is the specific cost of reading failure as a verdict instead of a report. The capability survives the failure. The information about what to redesign is available in the failure, but the verdict closes the door to both. Here is the first practical exercise that will help you access this immediately. It takes about 30 minutes. And the result is worth significantly more than 30 minutes of any other use of your time if you have a failure sitting unread in your history. Write down the most significant failure in your working or building history, the one that cost the most, hurt the most, or both. Now describe it in 3 specific parts, in writing. First, what specific thing stopped functioning? Not the general story of why you think you failed, the specific mechanical element that broke. A financial assumption that was wrong, a relationship that collapsed, a product that did not work as intended. Write the specific thing. Second, at what specific point did the failure become impossible to reverse? When did the specific thing that was failing reach the level where the operation could not continue? Write that specific threshold. Third, what would have needed to be different in the design of the operation for the specific thing that failed to have been stronger at that threshold? Not a general improvement in your character or your judgment. A specific design change that addresses the specific weakness at the specific point. Write that. The third part is the calibration data from the failure. It is the specific knowledge the failure produced that was not available before. It is the report extracted from the event and written down where you can use it. Most people who have failed at something have never done this extraction. The data is in the memory, but the memory has been filed under the verdict interpretation rather than the report interpretation. This exercise moves it from the verdict file to the report file. Do this before you continue with anything else. The rest of what I have to say builds on your ability to read failure as a report, and the exercise makes that ability concrete and immediate rather than abstract. The second thing I want to describe is what happens to confidence after a significant failure, and why the confidence that arrives after failure is more durable and more practically useful than the confidence that exists before it. Because this is a point that sounds backward, and I want to explain it precisely. Before my first company failed, my confidence about the direction was based on conviction. I was convinced the direction was right. The conviction was strong, and it sustained the building work through the difficulties of the early stages. But conviction, however strong it feels, is an untested belief. It has not been challenged by reality in the conditions that will actually test it. And untested conviction has a specific vulnerability. It cannot distinguish between the elements of the plan that are solid and the elements that have not yet encountered the condition that will expose their weakness. The confidence that exists after a significant failure, for the person who has read the failure correctly, is different in structure from pre-failure conviction. It is not built on the feeling of being right. It is built on the specific knowledge of where the previous attempt was wrong, which means the next attempt is designed around that knowledge rather than around the assumption that everything is solid. The post-failure builder knows specifically what broke and why, and has redesigned for it. The pre-failure builder is working on the assumption that nothing is broken. The post-failure confidence is quieter than conviction. It does not produce the same excited certainty that conviction produces, but it is more reliable under pressure because it is grounded in specific knowledge rather than in a feeling. When the next attempt encounters difficulty, the post-failure builder can evaluate whether the difficulty is in the redesigned element, which should now be stronger, or in a new area, which means new calibration data has been generated. The pre-failure builder evaluates difficulty against conviction, and conviction, under sufficient pressure, can collapse entirely because it has no specific knowledge underneath it. My second company failed too. The second failure was different from the first in an important way. I was more equipped to read it when it happened because I had learned from the first failure how to read the second. The second failure did not produce the verdict temptation as strongly as the first had, because I had already lived through the experience of reading a failure correctly and applying the calibration data. When the second company collapsed, the emotional weight was real and the cost was real, but the report reading happened faster because I had practiced it once already. What the second failure revealed was something different from what the first had revealed. The first had shown me a miscalibration in the production relationship between quality and cost. The second showed me a miscalibration in how I had understood the path to the market I was trying to reach. I had believed the path ran through a specific kind of buyer who would make the initial purchases and whose early adoption would signal to the broader market that the product was ready. This belief was wrong in a specific way. The buyers I had identified as the initial path had different requirements than the broader market had, and the product I had designed for those requirements was mismatched to the broader market in ways that prevented the transition from early adoption to wider use. The calibration data from this failure was precise. The early buyer and the broader market had different requirements, and building toward the early buyer's requirements at the cost of the broader market's requirements produces a bottleneck rather than a path. The Ford Motor Company's third attempt, the one that eventually built the Model T, was designed with this calibration. The Model T was not designed for an early adopter path. It was designed directly for the broadest possible market, with the requirements that market had, at the price that market could afford. That design decision came from the specific calibration data the second failure had produced. There is a man named Harvey who I want to mention here. Not for his failures, but for something he said to me once about the period after a significant loss that I have carried since. Harvey Firestone and I had known each other for years and had spoken many times about the work of building something from the beginning with no guarantee of outcome. Harvey had been through his own difficulties in the early years of his business, and we spoke once, during a quiet evening, at a gathering that Edison had arranged, about what failure actually costs a man versus what it appears to cost from the outside. Harvey said that the visible cost of a failure is what you can count. The money lost, the time spent, the people who were depending on you and were let down. Those costs are real, and they are the ones everyone sees. But the less visible cost, the one that most people do not account for accurately, is the time a man spends carrying the verdict of a failure rather than using the report of it. The verdict adds years to the cost because it prevents the calibration data from being applied. A man who lost 2 years building something that failed and spent the next 3 years carrying a verdict about himself has paid 5 years for what a man who read the failure correctly and applied it to a redesign paid 2 years for. Use the failure quickly. The emotional processing requires whatever time it requires, and that time should not be rushed. But the report reading should happen as soon as the emotional weight permits, because every month of verdict carrying is a month that the calibration data is sitting unused while the next attempt waits. Here is what it looked like in practice for me after the second company failed. The emotional wait lasted some months. I am not going to tell you it was brief or easy because that would be dishonest. The cost was real. The failure was visible to people whose respect I valued, and the quiet uncertainty about whether the pattern would simply repeat was present in a way it had not been after the first failure. What I did during that period, as soon as the wait permitted it, was to go back through the specific story of the second failure and write down every place where what I had believed had turned out to be different from what was actually true. Not to punish myself with the list, to extract the calibration data from each divergence. For each belief that had turned out to be wrong, I wrote the corrected version, what is actually true about this element, based on what the failure demonstrated. The list of corrected beliefs was the foundation of the third attempt, not the enthusiasm which had been present in all 3 attempts, not the conviction which had also been present in all 3. The specific corrected beliefs, grounded in the measurements the failures had produced rather than in the estimates that advanced thinking had produced. The third attempt was structurally different from the failed attempts in exactly the ways the calibration data indicated it needed to be, and those structural differences were the preparation for what eventually followed. This brings me to the third thing failure teaches that success cannot, and it is the most practically immediate of the 3 for your current situation. Failure teaches the specific difference between testing at the scale of a test and testing at the scale of the full operation. Most people who build something ambitious have ambition sized to the vision and capability sized to the previous experience. The vision is always larger than the previous experience. This means there is always a gap between what the ambition is asking for and what the capability has so far demonstrated. The question is not whether the gap exists. The question is at what scale the gap gets exposed. Exposing the gap at the scale of a test means the exposure costs the test, which is recoverable. Exposing the gap at the scale of the full operation means the exposure costs the operation, which is much harder to recover from. The man who builds the full operation on the assumption that the capability gap does not exist or will not matter is making the same mistake I made in the first 2 attempts. I built to a scale that exposed the gaps at the scale of the full operation. The gaps were real, and the operations paid the full cost of discovering them. After the second failure, I became specifically attentive to designing tests that would expose capability gaps at a recoverable scale before those gaps could become load-bearing in the full operation. The work at the small facility on Piquette Avenue in those early years of the Ford Motor Company was a systematic sequence of designed exposures at manageable scale. Every element of the operation that I was uncertain about, every capability gap I could identify in advance, was tested at a scale where the failure of that test would cost the test rather than the operation. This is why the Ford Motor Company did not fail. Not because I was more capable in the third attempt than in the first two, because the third attempt was designed with the specific knowledge of where the capability gaps were, and with tests that exposed and closed those gaps at manageable scale before the full operation was betting on them. Design the tests into your next attempt before you need them. Before the full operation is at stake, identify the specific elements you are most uncertain about, the capabilities you are assuming but have not yet demonstrated, and test them at the smallest scale that will produce meaningful information. The test can fail, and the operation continues. The operation, if it fails at full scale, takes everything with it. The second exercise I want to give you is this. Take whatever you are currently building or planning to build. Write down the 3 things you are most confident about, the beliefs you are holding with the most certainty, the elements of the plan you have not seriously examined because they seem obviously right. For each of these 3 certainties, write down what would have to be true in the real world for this certainty to be wrong, not what would have to go badly. What would have to be factually true about conditions out there for this belief to simply be incorrect? Write the specific factual condition. Now ask honestly, have you actually looked for evidence of whether that condition exists, or have you assumed it does not exist because your certainty told you it was unnecessary to check? If you have not looked, you are building on an untested conviction rather than a tested belief. The first 2 companies I attempted were built substantially on untested convictions. They felt like knowledge because I held them with the same confidence I hold actual knowledge. But conviction and knowledge are different, and the difference only becomes visible when the operation tests them against the real world. Test the convictions before the operation does. The testing is less expensive and more useful than waiting for the operation to do it for you. The lost lessons, taken together, are these. Failure is a report, not a verdict. Read it as a report. Extract the calibration data specifically, in writing. Build the next attempt on the corrected beliefs the calibration data produces rather than on the same convictions that the failed attempt was built on. Test the capability gaps at the scale of a test before building the full operation on the assumption that the gaps are not there. These are not abstract principles. Each of them has a specific and immediate application in your current situation. The exercise I gave you converts the failure in your history from a sealed verdict into an open report with usable data. The second exercise converts the untested convictions in your current building from invisible risks into visible ones that can be examined and corrected before the operation discovers them. The man who does both of these things is building with a map that the failure produced. The map shows exactly where the territory was dangerous in the previous attempt. It does not guarantee that the next attempt will not find new dangerous territory. New territory is always new, and maps of old failures do not cover new ground. But they cover the ground that was already traversed and found to be dangerous, which means the next attempt does not pay the full cost of discovering that ground twice. Use every failure you have had. Use it specifically. Extract the report, apply the calibration data, build on the corrected belief rather than on the original conviction, and design the tests into the next attempt at the scale where the tests can fail without taking the operation with them. The failures are the most specific and most expensive education available to a builder. The education is paid for, whether you use it or not. The only question is whether you actually use what you paid for. Now I want to go deeper into something that I have touched on but not yet fully examined, because it is the element that most people skip when they think about what failure costs and what it produces. Most conversations about failure stay on the surface of the event. What happened, what was lost, what was learned in a general sense. The surface reading is useful, but it leaves the most actionable part of the failure unexplored. The most actionable part is not what was lost. It is what the failure revealed about the assumptions that had been invisible before the failure made them visible. Every operation that fails was built on a set of assumptions. Some of those assumptions were correct, some were incorrect. The ones that were incorrect were not obviously incorrect before the failure, because if they had been obviously incorrect, they would have been corrected before the operation depended on them. They were hidden by the confidence that surrounded the whole direction, treated as background facts that did not need examination, accepted as obvious by everyone involved. And then the failure revealed them by demonstrating precisely where the operation stopped functioning when the incorrect assumption came under real load. The specific value of this is not just that you now know the assumption was wrong. The value is that you now know it was wrong in a specific way, under specific conditions, at a specific threshold. That specificity is what turns the wrong assumption into calibration data rather than just a painful memory. The painful memory does not help you build the next thing. The calibration data does, because it tells you precisely what to change in the design of the next attempt. I want to walk through the specific incorrect assumptions that my two failed companies were built on, because describing them in that level of detail makes the concept real in a way that abstraction does not. The first company's critical incorrect assumption was about the market for the product at the price point, the production cost required. I had assumed, with genuine conviction, that the buyers I was targeting could and would pay the price that the production cost made necessary. This assumption was built from real observation. I had spoken with potential buyers. I had seen how they spoke about the product. The demand seemed real. But the specific assumption about the price ceiling, the maximum these buyers would actually pay when the moment of real purchase arrived, rather than the moment of expressed interest, was higher than what the real market would bear. The expressed interest was genuine. The price ceiling was lower than expressed interest had suggested it would be. This is a specific kind of incorrect assumption that is extremely common in the early stages of building something. The interest of potential buyers is real, but the price they will actually pay when the product is in front of them and the decision is actual rather than hypothetical is different from the price they indicate they might pay in a conversation. Expressed interest and actual purchasing behavior are not the same measurement, and treating expressed interest as a reliable prediction of actual purchasing behavior is an assumption that many operations are built on and that many operations fail because of. After the first failure, I understood this distinction specifically, not in the abstract sense that I had read about it or heard it described. In the specific sense that I had measured it in my own operation and seen exactly how far apart the two numbers were and what that distance meant for the viability of the production cost structure. The calibration data was, expressed interest at price point X does not reliably predict actual purchase behavior at price point X. Actual purchase behavior must be tested at small scale before the production is built around the assumption that it will occur at scale. That calibration changed how I approached the development work in every subsequent attempt. Before building the production system to a scale that required a specific purchasing behavior to sustain it, I tested whether the actual purchasing behavior matched the expressed interest. The test was small and relatively cheap. The production system it was designed to protect was large and expensive. That asymmetry, small, cheap test protecting large, expensive commitment, was something I did not understand before the first failure and understood specifically after it. The second company's critical incorrect assumption was about sequencing. I had assumed that demonstrating the product to a specific segment of buyers who would influence the broader market was the right path to scale. The logic seemed sound. Influential early buyers would provide the visibility and credibility that would make the transition to broader market adoption possible. Build for the influential early buyers, earn their adoption, and the broader market follows. What the failure of the second company demonstrated was that the influential early buyers and the broader market had different requirements, and building the product to satisfy the influential early buyers had made it poorly matched to the requirements of the broader market. The product was well received by the early segment, and poorly received by the broader market it was supposed to reach through the early segment's influence. The path I had assumed would lead to scale led instead to a narrow position that the operation could not financially sustain. The calibration, when the final destination is the broad market, building for the early segment at the cost of the broad market's requirements, is not a path to the destination. It is a detour that ends before the destination is reached. Build for the final destination from the beginning, even if reaching it requires passing through an early stage. Do not optimize for the early stage so heavily that the product becomes unsuitable for the destination. The Model T was the direct application of this calibration. Every design decision about the Model T was made against the requirements of the broadest possible buyer, not against the requirements of an influential early segment. The price, the reliability, the simplicity of operation and maintenance, the durability under the road conditions most buyers would actually encounter. These were the requirements of the broad market, not the requirements of an early adopter segment. And the Model T was built to those requirements from the first design stage, not adapted toward them after an early segment phase. That design discipline, which came entirely from the calibration data of the second failure, is what made the Model T the thing it became. Without the second failure, the design discipline would not have been present in that form. The second failure was the education that produced the design. The education was expensive. The result was worth more than the cost. Now I want to address something that comes up every time this kind of conversation happens, and that I want to answer directly because leaving it unaddressed creates a gap in the practical usefulness of everything I have described. The gap is this: what do you do during the period between the failure and the next attempt? The extraction of calibration data, the identification of incorrect assumptions, the redesign of the operation around corrected beliefs, the design of tests to expose capability gaps at manageable scale before the full operation bets on them. All of this is the preparation for the next attempt. But preparation takes time, and the period of preparation has its own specific challenges that need to be named and addressed. The first challenge of the preparation period is the pressure from the people around you to interpret your situation in ways that are not useful. After a public failure, the people who care about you will have strong feelings about what you should do. Some will tell you to try again immediately because persistence is what builds success. Some will tell you to reconsider the direction entirely because the failure was a signal that this is not your path. Some will tell you to take more time before deciding anything. All of this advice comes from genuine care, and all of it is directed at the question of what to do next, which is actually the second question. The first question, the one that must be answered before the second one can be answered usefully, is what the failure was actually reporting about the operation. That question is the calibration extraction. And the calibration extraction cannot be rushed by well-meaning advice about what to do next. The second challenge of the preparation period is the temptation to start something new before the calibration from the failure has been fully extracted and applied. New beginnings feel energizing in a way that the work of reading a painful failure does not. The forward motion of a new start relieves the static discomfort of sitting with what the failure is revealing. But starting before the calibration is applied means starting from the same uncorrected beliefs that the failure was reporting as wrong. The new start will encounter the same gap between the belief and the fact at some point because the belief has not been corrected. The new start may fail in a different place and for a different reason, and that would produce different calibration data that would also be useful. But it is more expensive to learn from a second unrelated failure than to apply the calibration from the first failure and build the next attempt on the corrected foundation. Sit with the failure long enough to extract the calibration before starting the next thing. The extraction requires honest, specific, written work of the kind I described in the first exercise. It is not comfortable work. It involves looking directly at the places where the beliefs were wrong and writing down precisely how they were wrong and what is actually true instead. That work is not inspiring in the way that planning a new beginning is inspiring. But it is the work that makes the next beginning fundamentally different from the failed one, rather than the same beginning with renewed enthusiasm. There is a pattern I observed in the men around me throughout my building years that I think is worth naming clearly because it is so common that most people do not recognize it as a pattern. It looks like persistence, and it is actually something different. It looks like persistence because the man keeps starting things after failures. He does not give up. He keeps trying. And this is admirable in the general sense that giving up entirely would be worse. But if each new attempt is built on the same uncorrected beliefs that the previous attempts were built on, the persistence is not producing the compounding improvement that persistence in the right direction produces. It is producing the same failure in different forms, each of which generates calibration data that never gets extracted and applied. Persistence in the right direction is valuable beyond almost any other quality a builder can have. Persistence without extracted calibration is effortful repetition. Know which one you are doing. If you are starting your third or fourth attempt at something, and the attempts are structurally similar to each other in the ways that matter, the calibration data from the failures may not have been extracted and applied. This is worth examining honestly before the next attempt, because the next attempt built on the corrected foundation is more valuable than 3 more attempts built on the uncorrected one. I am going to describe one more thing about what the failure years produced that I consider among the most important and that I have not yet fully addressed. It is about the relationship between what you know and what you think you know, and how the failure changes that relationship in a way that improves every significant decision you make from that point forward. Before a significant failure, most builders operate on a mixture of actual knowledge and confident belief, and the two feel identical from the inside. Both are held with confidence. Both inform decisions with equal apparent authority. The problem with this mixture is not that it feels confident, it is that the confident belief has the same apparent authority as the actual knowledge, which means decisions made on confident belief look and feel the same as decisions made on actual knowledge, but they have a different relationship to what is actually true out there in the conditions the operation has to survive in. The failure makes the distinction between the two visible. After a significant failure, a builder who reads it correctly can look back at the beliefs he held before the failure and sort them into 2 categories: the ones that turned out to be correct and the ones that turned out to be wrong. This sorting is not possible before the failure because both categories felt identically confident before the test. After the test, the sorting is possible because reality has labeled them. Once you have done this sorting even once, even on one significant failure, your relationship with your own confident beliefs changes in a specific and permanent way. You know from direct experience that confident beliefs and actual knowledge feel the same from the inside but are not the same thing. This knowledge makes you more likely to test your confident beliefs before building large things on them, because you have seen specifically what happens when the untested confident belief turns out to be in the wrong category. This changed relationship with your own confident beliefs is one of the most practically valuable things a failure produces. It does not make you less confident. It makes your confidence more accurately calibrated to what you actually know versus what you believe. That calibration is an improvement in every significant decision you make from that point forward, because the decisions now have a better map of which elements they are building on solid ground, and which elements they are building on ground that has not yet been tested. The man who has never had a significant failure does not have this calibration. He may be talented and capable and work very hard, but he cannot distinguish between his actual knowledge and his confident beliefs in the way that the man who has failed and read the failure correctly can. The failure produced a kind of seeing that was not available before it, and the seeing, once developed, cannot be undeveloped. It is a permanent improvement in the quality of judgment that no amount of advanced study could have produced. This is the deepest reason I am genuinely grateful for the failures, not for the pain they caused, which was real and which I would not seek to repeat, but for the specific quality of seeing they produced, the ability to distinguish between what I actually know and what I only believe confidently, which has informed every significant decision in the building of the Ford Motor Company from the beginning. You have failures. Every person who has tried to build something significant has failures in their history. The failures you are carrying are the most expensive education you have received. The cost was paid when the failure happened. The only question is whether you will use what you paid for. Use it. Extract the calibration data. Write down the specific incorrect assumptions. Identify the specific design corrections the calibration indicates. Test the next attempt at the scale of a test before the full operation bets on the corrected beliefs. And understand that the quality of seeing the failure has given you the ability to distinguish confident belief from actual knowledge is a capability that will improve every significant decision you make from today forward if you develop it deliberately rather than letting it sit in the same sealed file as the verdict. The lost lessons are not a consolation prize for having failed. They are the specific preparation that the success required. The preparation was paid for at a price you did not choose. Now use it. That is the only response to a real loss that produces something more than the loss itself. Listen to this every day until reading failure as a report is your first response rather than something you have to remind yourself to do. See you soon.